Belgrade Security Conference starts in 5 minutes. Belgrade Security Conference starts in 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your coffee, and welcome back to our second academic panel, Case Studies, Security Development Nexus in Peace Building and Conflict Prevention. So I'd like to have our panelists walk on and moderator. This is Zhanyek Rod, Janisa Patel, Esha Banerai, Alexandria Krustek, and Richard Stein as the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone. I hope we're all refreshed after some caffeine. I want to thank as well Amanda for the warm introduction and also just reflect a little bit on this morning's session. So to thank all the speakers for their insights into the security and development and human rights nexus, both in theory and practice. This panel will be slightly different, so we're going to dive into case studies of the security development nexus. So for me personally, I've always felt that the 2030 agenda sounds good, but if it doesn't translate to change on the ground, then it really means nothing. So this panel is really about exploring the application on the ground. So with that, I want to hand the floor to our first speaker, Janisa Patel. And I want to invite you to present your findings of your research paper, Security and Instability, Transforming Societies Through Equitable Distribution Mechanisms. Janisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. It's wonderful to be here today. When thinking about SDG 16, my colleague Amanda Lucy and I really wanted to try and understand what the role of formal and informal institutions are in creating more inclusive, just and equitable access to critical scarce resources. And we think, especially in the African context, that this question is going to be relevant for the security development nexus in the decades to come, and likely for the rest of the century, especially as climate change stresses make critical scarce resources even more scarce, harder to access, and give rise to tensions at a very localized level. And so what we wanted to do is drill down to that local level, and we looked at 3 different case studies. We looked at land in central Mali, we looked at water scarcity in the arid and semi-arid regions of northeast Kenya, and we also did something different with the 3rd case study and looked at the equitable distribution of extractive revenues in northern Mozambique, and specifically related to liquid natural gas that was recently discovered there. And overarchingly, we find, and as many of you will expect that we find, a sort of vicious cycle or a negative feedback loop between security and development, or sort of insecurity and bad development policies, where, and for the sort of sake of explanation, we could start with development deficits that create grievances that sort of lead to deteriorating security situations, which in turn worsen the prospects for inclusive development, and so on the cycle goes. And our thinking behind this research was that we really wanted to find leverage points or entry points into that cycle, and really think about how we can start breaking that cycle, the sort of vicious cycle, and turning it into a more prosperous and inclusive one. We did this by looking at a network approach, because we felt that if we could map the system that governs the scarce resource, try and understand sort of what the power dynamics are within the system, we could identify leverage points for policy and programs where they might then sort of create more inclusive governance mechanisms for these scarce resources that are giving rise to tensions. And so I don't think we have time to get into the great detail of all three case studies, but I'll touch briefly on the Kenyan case study and the Mozambican one, because I think that they both have interesting parallels, although very contrasting systems of governance, where in the Kenyan case, they have a very decentralized system of governance, and in Mozambique, they have a highly centralized one. But the outcomes on the ground are sort of felt in a very similar way. So briefly, in Kenya and sort of in the northeastern regions of Kenya, there's water scarcity, but water is also used as a political bargaining chip, whereby politicians offer free water or access to free water or low-cost water in exchange for votes. They also use water infrastructure projects to leverage patronage, or as a sort of vehicle for patronage and corruption. The region is also seen from the central state as the sort of useless region for development prospects, so not a lot of resources make their way up north, and the security situation has been deteriorating progressively. For example, and I think a really interesting policy that the Kenyan government has for the region in terms of security is that they send the law enforcement up there is staffed with officers who are serving time for punishment for abusive conduct or misconduct, and so sort of they send them up there to serve a time of punishment. And so you see that the law enforcement is staffed with probably the worst of the sort of national law enforcement task force, and this doesn't instill a lot of confidence in the local populations, meaning that these populations then feel that they need to take security into their own hands, and this is causing an influx of light arms and weapons into the region. And so when local communities, and in the region it's a lot of pastoralists and farmers and tribal and ethnic communities, when they now come into clashes with each other over access to water, like things like boreholes, water points and so on, these conflicts are becoming more deadly and more lethal. And so we see that this cycle is at play of sort of underdevelopment, poor security, provision, and so on the cycle goes. And then we see something quite similar in northern Mozambique as well. So for context, Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique is also a periphery region, severely underdeveloped compared to the rest of the country, and especially the south. It's a hub for transnational organized crime. And then atop of that, there's an Islamist insurgency that's been raging since 2017. Then there's been a discovery of liquid natural gas, 125 trillion cubic feet of liquid natural gas in Cabo Delgado. What this presents is an opportunity to break this negative feedback loop by extracting revenues that could be used to develop the region and address many of the sort of material drivers of the insurgency and the discontent in the region. But the concern is that Mozambique, or the network of governance in Mozambique, is characterized by a very centralized system. It's dominated by elite bargaining, and most of society, especially up in the north, those with a little agency, don't have much say sort of in state-centric policy making and so on. And we already see that the process of sort of prospecting for natural gas has been creating grievances. Communities are being forcibly displaced. Peacekeeping missions are being used to secure the gas sites rather than protecting civilians and so on. And so there is this great potential for development, but it is not being harnessed to its full potential, and in a way it's causing even more grievances in the north. Just very quickly, there is some promising development. In August, the government released a document saying that 10% of gas revenues should make their way back up to the north, but when we spoke to sort of key civil society representatives, their concern is that any money that does make its way back to Cabo Delgado from gas revenues is just going to be captured by well-positioned political elite. And so what we really need to be thinking about is how we break these cycles of sort of extractive governance, insecurity, and bad development policies that feed into one another.
Thank you so much. I think your reflections on one of the major challenges to the security development nexus, and that is the securitization of development processes. And I think you really kind of underlined how the unequal access to resources is a key causal factor in explaining the onset of conflict. So, I mean, there's a lot more to say, but in the interest of time, allow me to hand to our second speaker, Professor Alexandra Kristik, who will present her paper, Images of Insecurity, Visualizing Borders, Migrants, and Control in Serbia's News Media. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everyone. So this summer, when now former Minister of Interior of Serbia visited one of the camps along the Hungarian border to present the results from the joint action that they provided, the main image and the video that showed up across the news coverage was showing the minister, former Minister of Interior, standing over with a couple of people from the border authorities, with the kneeling migrants with arms behind their heads. And it triggered a really serious reaction from non-governmental organizations and many media associations in the country. And it's a very common image of treating migrants and refugees on the borders, showing control and the rather negative coverage of migrants and refugees coming to Serbia. So in many European media, migrants and refugees are usually represented as a threat to borders, to the security of people, to the public health, or as victims of war, victims of mistreatment of the host country, etc. So it's a pretty polarized coverage across European media when it comes to migration, the politics of migration. So we can ask ourselves why images are important. Well, you have to know that we remember them longer than words, and they affect human emotions and human decision-making and political decision-making. So this negative, sensational, and often tabloid coverage, very often manipulative press coverage along the press or television stations around the world. It's pretty much polarized across Europe. And for example, this image of the border, which I explore in my research paper, is one of the key dimensions when we talk about treatment of migrants and refugees in any country. So you have all seen these images of people arriving to the border and people living on the border. So we can talk about the border as a physical space and the border as a symbolic space, border as a contested political space where, for example, politicians use the border as a photo opportunity to shake hands or to give statement. But we have to think who gets to occupy the border? Are those authorities? Are those migrants? And I argue that these are images of insecurity with in brackets. So it's security for whom? Security very often presented for people living on this side of the border as a majority for Serbian people, and images of insecurity for migrants and refugees coming from Asia and many African countries. So these are aspects of visuality, like are they long shots? Are they kept at a safe distance from the viewers, from the readers? Are they presented as individuals or in groups? And we can debate that. But the more important is the aspect of the visibility of migrants and refugees on borders. So when we talk about this, we have to discuss it in the other way. So I researched, I analyzed 9 most important newspapers in Serbia and their online versions. And what my research showed, as I focused on the images of borders, is that there is a dominant threat frame. Migrants and refugees as a threat to the security of borders, very often as a cause of other country threat to Serbia. For example, in 2015 and 16, when media covered the Hungarian decision to build a fence on the border and said migrants are guilty for that, and Orban was called sick and chauvinistic and unreasonable politician. The other 2 dominant frames also are very equal in their coverage. It's both administrative frame showing migrants as numbers, and the other one migrants as victims. So it's lacking humanitarian coverage. We don't see people on borders, border authorities as saviors, as for example in Italian media, when my colleagues from Italy researched the maritime borders of the Mediterranean, it was shown that the border authorities are trying to save migrants or people. Here you see having it all under control. And for example, unlike other press coverage around the world that show migrants outnumbering the police forces on borders, here in Serbia you have quite the opposite. You have a lot of pictured police officers on the border outnumbering the migrants and conveying a message that we have it under control. So it's it's security for whom? It's security for people living on this side of the border, and it's the images of insecurity for people arriving from different parts of the world, fleeing from conflicts and wars, etc. And regarding the time frame, I researched the time frame from 2015 until 2020, and over this time frame, you can see that migrants on borders in Serbia, they were represented at the beginning as victims of war. But nowadays, in 2020, they have been represented more as the victims of their own intergroup crimes. And not, we forgot that they are victims of the war, that they're escaping some conflicts and wars. So it's kind of a worrying coverage. It's lacking this humanitarian dimension. And we can talk about it more in detail later. But this is just, I just wanted to present the key findings. I have this, just to add one sentence, I have the percentages here. For example, 80% of the coverage is from the wide and long shot. So it's keeping the migrants and refugees at a safe distance from the viewer, so that we as viewers cannot engage with these people fleeing from wars and conflicts. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think, thank you for presenting your findings. I think it also underscores one of the real challenges with the security development nexus, being that it provides governments with the opportunity to securitize development issues. And you raised, or you discussed about the visual aspects of that and the importance of that. So I think with that, allow me to hand over to our third speaker, Aisha Banjari. I hope I pronounced that.
Banerjee.
Okay, close enough. Who will present her paper, Defense Reforms, National Security and Development, Exploring India's Agnipath Scheme. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the organizers for having me here, and namaste, everyone. On 14th of June 2022, the Government of India launched the Agnipath Scheme. Agnipath literally translates to a path of fire. While some call it radical, the others call it irrational. I leave that decision up to you. I call it transformative. Before I get into the details of this scheme, I will briefly speak on India's security environment, because it sort of sets the foundation and the rationale for this scheme. India faces security threats from both internal as well as external sources in the 21st century. The security environment is not threatening per se, but it is unstable, especially because we are positioned between two nuclear-powered countries, both of which we have fought wars with, and both of which we have unresolved territorial disputes with. Furthermore, insurgencies, communal religious riots, the rising socio-economic inequality, and unemployment are all factors that add to the internal security concerns of India. The immense size of the subcontinent and the stark differences in the potential battle zones pose enormous difficulties for the Indian armed forces. There is a threat of what we in India call the two-front war. And the role of technology also plays a very significant role in this regard. The Indian administration faces the dual challenge of preparing the armed forces to address a more diverse set of threats while simultaneously restructuring the forces to respond to the defense needs of the 21st century. India requires a modern combat soldier who is not only tech-friendly but also tech-savvy. And this is where Agnipath comes into the picture. So what is this scheme? Agnipath is basically a pan-India scheme that provides for the recruitment of youths from the age of 17 and a half to 21 in the defense forces of India for all the three services, the Indian Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, based on the principle of all India, all class, and for a period of 4 years, with the provision of retaining 25% of them at the end of 4 years for them to join the regular cadre of the Indian Armed Forces. In terms of security development nexus, Agnipath is neither a wholly security-centered approach to India's security challenges, nor is it a wholly development-centered approach. It is a balance between the two. Agnipath gives ample push to the idea of inclusivity, which lies at the heart of SDG 16 and is a key to the success of security sector governance. It puts an end to the ongoing colonial practice of preferentially hiring your soldiers from martial castes or races. It is also launched as a gender-neutral scheme. The percentage of women in the Indian Armed Forces is extremely low. It is less than 7%, and in some branches, even less than 1%. So Agnipath, aside from opening up the gates of the Indian Armed Forces for women more substantively, will also mark the first time that that positions of personnel below officer rank are open to women. This, you can see, is in line with SDG 5, which talks about gender equality. Further speaking on the development aspect of the scheme, Agnipath also has the ability to attract young talent from the country, provide them with quality training, and to further refine their skills, and basically supply the nation with not only a young and agile and tech-savvy armed force, but also a motivated and disciplined workforce. The training, the 4-year training that they will go through, the Agniveers. The trainees of the Agnipath scheme are called Agniveers, which loosely translates to fire warriors. So the 4-year training that they will receive is expected to aid in capacity building, and together with the exit plan that has been laid out by the government, will improve their chances of finding employment. Now you might ask, how so? Well, we know that 25% of the Agniveers will go on to join the regular cadre of the Indian Armed Forces. But what about the 75%? Now, in the first batch itself, the 75% accounts to 34,500 young trainees. The government, along with states and the private sector, has laid down various options for a smooth transition into a second career. State governments have expressed interest in hiring the de-inducted Agniveers into police services and other related positions. So while some might not, while 25% will go into the regular armed forces, the rest 75%, some of them will still be a part of the security apparatus of the country in a different manner. On the education front, those Agniveers who want to continue with their education will be provided a bridge course to prepare them for a higher education. And the government of India, along with a university in India, will launch or is planning to launch a skill-based bachelor's degree, wherein the training period that they receive will account to some credits in the course that they do. Agniveers will also receive entrepreneurial help in terms of preferential bank loans, which is basically to support their startups and is expected to boost defense indigenization in India, something that the government is proactively rooting for. The Home Ministry and Defense Ministry have also earmarked 10% of the jobs for Agniveers in other security forces, namely the Central Armed Police Forces, the Assam Rifles, the Indian Coastal Guard, etc. Numerous well-known industrialists, such as the Tata Sons, the Mahindras, have also shown interest in hiring the Agniveers. Thus, Agnipath has the potential to address, albeit in a limited scope, the rising and the pertinent problem of unemployment in the Indian society, especially post-COVID. So this is also in line with the SDG 8, which talks about tackling with unemployment. On the security front, the implications are quite straightforward. The scheme will result in a young, agile, and a tech-savvy Indian Armed Forces, which is ready to fight the battles of the 21st century. It will reduce the average age of the soldiers from 32 at present to 26. To put this in context, the average age of soldiers in UK is 25. It promotes meritocracy in the Indian Armed Forces, both in the induction as well as in the retention phase, as the top 25% of the batch, the cream, will go on to be inducted. And this selection that will happen of the 25% is not through an exam or something, but through a continuous, extensive assessment that will be done throughout the 4 years. While there is so much more to say, I will conclude by saying that unlike war-torn areas of the world where security development nexus is seen in the context of post-conflict recovery, in Indian context, we need to see this in terms of prevention of a conflict. Thus, policies, institutions, and infrastructure have to be made in such a way that they can ensure security and development of both the nation as well as the citizens. And in this context, when you see the Agnipath scheme, you sort of get a clearer image of where it lies in the security development discourse that we are having. I'll end on this note, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think the Agnipath scheme is particularly interesting because it's a kind of a manifestation of the security development nexus at the policy level. So on the one hand, you have the desire to increase the representativeness of the Indian population within the armed forces, including women, which is a key goal of security sector reform. And on the other side, you have this development aspect about empowering people to be employed in the private sector. So I think it's a really interesting combination of what we see as the security development nexus at the state level. So thanks so much for your insights there.
Thank you.
So now I think we'll hand to our last speaker, Zenek Rod, who will be presenting his paper, The Application of the Security Development Nexus, Lessons Learned from Provincial Reconstruction Teams in Afghanistan. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me here. Hello, everyone. Dobré den. Before I begin with my presentation, let me allow to start with a very short quote, kind of to set the ground. The provincial reconstruction teams, so-called the PRTs, became to the development security nexus what the light bulbs were to electricity. Before Edison's invention, many people would have heard of electricity, but few would have understood its own meaning. So this is kind of the rationale beyond why I decided to analyze the PRTs as an example of the application of the security development nexus, particularly in Afghanistan, since the nexus perspectives were embedded in those teams. And before I continue, it's also convenient to mention what the PRTs were. PRTs were special civil and military units that were aimed to foster the security and development environment in a given Afghan provinces. And the concept itself was firstly introduced in 2002, 2003 by the US, and it was based on the US counterinsurgency doctrine. However, later on, the PRTs were deployed by not only the US, but further NATO nations and NATO allies. Therefore, what could have been observed, we could have observed different form of nexus in the field. For instance, some nations emphasize security over development. It can be the US or the Hungarian case. On the other side, some of them emphasize the development activities over the security. It can be the British or the Canadian case. And some of the nations were kind of trying to find a balance between security and development. It can be, for instance, the Czech case in Logar. And it's also fair to say the PRTs were deployed between 2003 and 2014, approximately. And so those are the reasoning why I chose to analyze the PRTs. And also we kind of lack some considerable data about what happened in the PRTs, because they are seen as a particular failure, even though they were implemented for more than 10 years. Some countries are analyzing the PRT experience right now. For instance, the Netherlands is analyzing actually what happened, so it's becoming kind of an actual topic. And lastly, based on that long experience, I wanted to draw some lessons learned, the best practices that could be used in the future peace building activities. And let me share a few of them with you. Also, I didn't focus only on desk research. I did some visits, for example, to the NATO CIMIC Center in The Hague. I talked approximately with 30 people coming from military, highly positioned commanders from PRTs, ranging from mayor to two-star generals, and with highly positioned development workers from various countries. So I've got kind of a comprehensive material on that. And based on the research, I've got a couple of lessons learned that could be used. First of all, it's very simple, but all of the countries seemed they were struggling with that, having clear goals. What does it mean? The PRTs were provided do development, but actually no one knew what the development should look like in a given province. So what happened then? Each country pursued development strategies as they wanted. It didn't have to reflect the local needs, whatever. There wasn't any common approach. That's maybe the first one. Second, for instance, in terms of Afghanistan, what turns out, at the beginning, it was meant as a horizontal reconstruction. But at the end, it went to the given provinces. So there was basically missing a common approach to reconstruction. Afghanistan was never a horizontal way of reconstruction. When I was talking with two-star Dutch General Ton van Loon, he told me, each nation going to the provinces meant the repetition of so-called Balkanization. There wasn't any common approach. Each country took over a given province and implemented what they were good at. And that didn't mean that the things they were good at were going hand in hand with the needs of the locals. So for instance, if the given PRT didn't have any experience, or the nation had any experience with development activities, they were just not doing development activities. They were just focusing on security. I will come back to that. Come back to that later. Third, PRTs have to contain, should have contained. It can be also seen in the current CIMIC missions. Should have contained skilled and experienced personnel. We will focus on their advantages. And most of the PRTs, for instance, the soldiers in there, they had very little experience about some CIMIC activities, for instance. As well as some of the development workers were not so skilled for the activities. And also what is important to say, what everyone have noticed so far, that the military personnel, development personnel, their activities should be going hand in hand with each other. However, sometimes it went to the fact that military activities were clearly separated from the development activities, so they were not fostering each other. So there was missing the role of the government approach. Local ownership. Only few nations really took, basically, were interesting what the locals really needed. I would say that the reconstruction, and it was reflected in Afghanistan, should have been a bottom-up project, but mostly it was top-down. For instance, from some, let's say, from some US and Hungarian cases that I analyzed, just the local development officers were, for instance, doing the things they perceive as best, but it wasn't reflecting the needs. There is various cases where the PRTs dig wells on one side of the village, which took water from the other side of the village, and the other side of the village then hated the PRTs for many years, and so forth. Also observed, many of the PRT personnel lacked or wasn't aware of the historical and cultural roots in each specific area. it's very important to always know how do locals function, what they need, how they feel, what they want. Usually most of the personnel had like a few days or maximum 2 months long training, and the historical part, some cultural part was like a few days long. Also the PRT, so when they were doing reconstruction, different states, they were not exchanging information between them, mostly. So they were not even asking what works in your case, what doesn't work. So each nation really was like in a, I would say it was like an aquarium, working on their own without any exchange of information. And also huge problems with corruption. The PRTs as the CIMIC unit were not particularly monitoring, for instance, where the development aid goes, so corruption issues. And also, the very last point, many of the things, for instance, that were set in the policy documents were not reflected on the field. Let's say that the CIMIC unit is always considered that they should foster so-called the whole of government approach. But when I was analyzing, for example, the Norwegian case, I was talking to the Norwegian generals, they said, well, yes, we had the whole of government approach in the strategies, but we were clearly instructed separate military development activities from each other, not to combine them together. So those are a couple of the things I drew, and I'm happy to talk about them later.
Thanks so much, Rod. I think there's a lot to take from your research, and I think it's really interesting. We've discussed this morning, particularly in Luca's panel, about the security development nexus at the normative level, at the New York level, at the agenda level, and we've kind of zoomed down to the policy level now, looking at how it's implemented at the state level. And now we've zoomed down to the operational level. And I think we often forget, or at least I do, that the security development nexus is a military concept now. It's an operationalized concept on the ground. And I think your research demonstrates many of the problems with applying it on the ground. I think one of the key findings that really struck me was in the context of a multinational ISAF counterinsurgency, having clear guidance and goals is very difficult when you have 15, 20 states contributing troops. There's much more to say on that, and I think we'll get to that during the Q&A, but thank you so much. I want to now, before we move on to the audience Q&A, I have a question for all our panelists. There are concerns, and I think this session and the one before have underlined this, there are concerns that national and global policy is proceeding as though there is broad agreement on the workings of the security development nexus. As some of your papers have shown, this is not always the case. So given that we are only 8 years away from the end of the 2030 agenda, we're in the decade of action, as they call it, and given that discussions are already beginning on the post-2030 agenda, I'd be interested to hear how you see your research and your findings informing the design of the post-2030 agenda. So what could be done differently? Let's perhaps start with Janisha, please.
Sure, it's a really good question, Richard. In the paper, we lay out a number of recommendations for policymakers, but I'll touch on two. One that sort of focuses on a bottom-up perspective and one that focuses on a top-down perspective, because I think all the panelists have touched on both really nicely. So when we were mapping these networks, we find that there are many subgroups in the African context, and often these subgroups within civil society are made up of various tribal and ethnic cleavages. And what is happening really is that these subgroups are failing to act together and act collaboratively and are instead in constant competition with one another. And I think post-2030, we need to start thinking about how we can build social capital, horizontal social capital between the subgroups within the network, so that programs are aimed at trust building and help to foster a sense of collaboration and codependence amongst subgroups, so that they instead see each other or see each group as an opportunity for collaboration rather than competition. And this sort of helps to ease tensions at the grassroots level by returning agency to these groups. What it also does is it allows them to overcome or helps them to overcome some of their challenges by sharing knowledge, by creating room to foster innovation. And it gives them a sense of, or makes it easier for these groups to overcome the dominant players in the network. In the African context, this is often the state or sort of networks of patronage that dominate the governance of resources. So it's a sense, it's about sort of returning agency to the civil society level through bridging between all the different subgroups and the sort of social fragmentations. And then on the other hand, in the African context, I think what's relevant when we're talking about institutions is that they are formal institutions, but they are also informal institutions. And in a lot of these periphery regions, the informal institutions often enjoy more perceived legitimacy than formal institutions. And so what we need to start thinking about is how we could bring formal and informal institutions together so that they might be working in harmony, so that they don't have overlapping mandates and so on, so that we could get the best out of both of these different types of institutions, both often equally or sometimes where informal institutions are seen as more legitimate than formal institutions, so that together there is some consensus on how to sort of improve inclusive development and security provisions.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think this is one of the concerns we're all aware of, the state-centric nature of the SDGs, and I think your comments reflect a battle that was fought in New York to get an indicator in Target 16.3 on access to justice that captured informal mechanisms. And this was a big fight, and there was success in that regard. But I still, I would agree with you that I think this need to think more about what peace means on the ground, hybrid forms of peace, is perhaps something that can really inform the 2030 agenda. How that's done in practice is for another day to discuss. But thanks so much. Shall we now move on to Aisha then, please?
Thank you, Richard. While it is true that the general consensus of this panel and the panel before us was that the security development nexus is pretty on paper, but in practice it faces enormous challenges. However, I would like to have a slightly different approach. I agree that it is premature of me to say the Agnipath scheme is a success, but it will also not be wise of me to say that it is a failure. Now, the concept of security development nexus hasn't yet found its place in Indian discourse. So the thing is that as we speak, the first batch of Agniveers are yet to be inducted. So I think for us, in terms of the 2030 agenda, what we have to do is start a conversation on this concept in India and see whether we are an exception to the norm or not. And if not, then we have to figure out a set of regional policies or a set of solutions that work for our country. So I think that is something that we need to focus on right now, start a conversation on the concept, bring about awareness so that more research can be done.
Thanks so much. I think the Agnipath scheme is fascinating. I know there are concerns about some of the intentions, and that's fair. But I look forward to, in the next few years, seeing the results, and particularly the development side, seeing the numbers of people that went through this scheme that were able to acquire diplomas, degrees, and go on to work in the private sector. Right. So I look forward to reading the paper, and maybe a new one in a few years once the scheme is.
4 years. 4 years.
4 years, okay, yes. So 4 years to wait, but yeah, okay. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Alexandra then. Please, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Richard. I think we should think about bringing media back in as an important agent of human rights-based approach towards the better visibility of vulnerable groups. So when we talk about the SDGs and talk about the issues of inequality, we have to think about fostering more human-based narratives and changing the narratives around migration, migrants, refugees, etc., having now the war in Ukraine with many people fleeing the country. And there are some great initiatives already around the world that are changing the narratives towards migration and the politics of migration. I'm proud to be one of the representatives of the University of Belgrade in the Global Media Migration Academy led by the University of Galway in Ireland. We've been cooperating together on training our students who are about to enter the profession of professional journalism, how to approach the issue of migration and the coverage of refugees. So actually, if you want to think about reducing inequality or giving, you have to think about giving access to the media to people who are not present in the media, in the mainstream media. We see a lot of migrants and a lot of refugees being prone to fake news and disinformation and a lot of manipulating coverage. We have to think, especially in this context of Serbia, where television is the most watched, the most watched and the main source of information for Serbian citizens of how to bring back, how to bring editors and media professionals into this conversation. I've noticed in my research a very huge gap in the confrontation between visual and textual material. So in images, you see people who are peaceful on borders, who are not doing anything. They're just lying down or waiting for something to happen. While on the textual side, on the side of the headlines and the captions of the image, you can read this is a stampedo, they are invading, there are 2 million of refugees coming to threaten the Serbian nation, etc. So there is a very, very big gap between this visual and the textual, but how you are deciding, you have to think of the context. So you're not only looking at the image, you are also reading, and it's the first thing that actually gets into our mind. When you look at the newspapers, then you just look at the image and the caption. And although you see a very peaceful and vulnerable group which are presented as victims or as people who are waiting for their being integrated into society or transiting to another country, on the other side you are reading about the invasion, and it actually fuels the negative attitudes. And I have to add that the Belgrade Center for Human Rights and other really distinguished non-governmental organizations researched the people's opinion about the migrants and refugees, and more than 50% of Serbian people would not welcome a refugee into their home, although we have a very extensive past of welcoming people from during the wars at the Balkans. And on the other side, 70% of Serbs really think that political parties should give their opinion when running for elections about what their stand on migration is. And it's a very big thing here. So I think we should all think about, when we talk about the security and development in these conflict environments, that the media are the key player, and this is the key dimension if you want to mediate your message to publics and to auditorium. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I guess one of the thoughts that came to my mind when you were talking was that the SDGs were, of course, agreed upon before the era of disinformation. This is a new threat that I think we're all facing, and one which probably needs to be taken into account when designing the post-2030 agenda. There's also lots more to say on that, but thanks so much. Rod, in the interest of time, let me turn to you, and then I think we will have a few minutes, hopefully, for some questions from the audience. So please, Rod, over to you.
I would say that the SDG goal is generally well designed. However, when it comes to the application of the nexus, it seems that they kind of misunderstand that. The nexus exists; it's somewhere there. The Euro-Atlantic, let's say, peace and society is based on a nexus. But it seems that when we try to apply that in the post-conflict zone or fragile environments, it doesn't work as we want to, and it basically goes hand in hand with some of the things I had noticed before. I would also say that we should have, as was mentioned during the first panel, some shared and common language. Security development nexus, but when we operationalize that, what do we mean by that? Is it sex and security precedes development, or is the other way around, or it kind of mutually reinforce each other? So we should have that common language. And when I assume, just shortly, briefly, when applying the nexus, it should be always tailored to the specific region or specific situation, which goes hand in hand, that the application of the nexus should be supported by a very skilled personnel. It should be skilled by the personnel that also knows what the region needs. It shouldn't be basically deployed or enhanced by people that are good at something, should be deployed, enhanced by some people that are good at something. It goes also hand in hand with the needs. So the local ownership must be also fostered. What I also kind of noticed that when applying the nexus in LSV, it's a long-term thing. The thing is that we don't know how long it should be. Definitely it shouldn't be 5 or 10 years. When I was talking with the German officers, one colonel told me, well, I think the PRTs should have been implemented for 2 generations. Well, I assume it's any government cannot justify that we will be supporting some sending mission for 50 years, right? So, but generally it's a long-term initiative. The whole of government approach must be kind of embedded in the nexus. The military and development actors must be cooperating with each other. They cannot have separated domains that do not basically reinforce each other. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And also, as basically Professor here said, that the communication or basically it's very important. Yes, also when deploying the CIMIC missions, for instance, the officers that were in Afghanistan or right now in Mali, they are saying, yes, we need to have efficient strategic communication towards the locals because we have to explain them why we are here, what we are doing, and how can we help them. And maybe a very last point is that based on the 2 years long research, what I also observed, the reconstruction could be coming from the locals. And let's say the CIMIC units should be helping and should provide some guidance. But at the end, it shouldn't be, let's say, the peace-building actors that are completely responsible for the whole reconstruction. That maybe seems like one of the points, which would, in this case, it will also consequently foster the local ownership because it will be coming from the locals. And let's say the peace builders should be providing the guidance and the assistance, but it shouldn't be completely on them. The government, the local government should play a key role. That's in my opinion.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Rod. Yeah, I mean, lots there again. I think one thing that comes through to me is that the security development nexus at the operational level must be tailored to the context. Yes. And you know, the counterinsurgency context, if we can call it that, in Afghanistan was very specific, and we've seen the results of that, which after 20 years are arguable. But before I open the floor, we have 4 minutes. I just want to just kind of raise the mood as well, because I feel as if, you know, we've all been rightly critical of the security development nexus, but I also remember the days, well, I was young, but with the MDGs, where there was no goal on peace and justice. You know, we've come a long way, where the target was the global south, quote unquote, where this essentialization of developing countries was the paradigm that pushed forward, you know, our approaches to global development paradigms. We've come a long way, so I think it's right for us to be critical, but also to remember the space that the SDGs provide for us to have these types of discussions. So I will stop talking. We have 3 minutes, so I really hope we have a quick question. Oh, Sonia, is it going to be difficult? No? Do I see someone at the back? Or if not, Sonia? I can't see back there because of the light, sorry. Sonia, please.
Thank you. Sorry for taking time. Two quick questions for Esha. The example you gave is super interesting on how security actors can help development. But I was wondering, should military solve our public problems? And not just in case of India. I mean, we've seen in Latin America, in this country, since COVID, military is doing jobs instead of other public institutions because they are most capable, most professional, and keeping some of the powers that were introduced because of state of emergency. Should we be worried that they will go into politics again, you know, and take over the role of other institutions that will not fulfill that role? So this militarization of society, how is that tackled in this initiative? And one quick question for Alexandra about the media. I mean, SSR should be, in theory, it's political process, but usually that's forgotten. And you have nicely highlighted this question, security for whom and how. But in countries like ours, where media freedom is not there, how the framing influences public opinion and public demand. And maybe an example of migration, you gave statistics of a current public opinion. But was it different in 2015 when our government had a more pro-humanitarian approach? And if you could, maybe I know you haven't researched all other topics, but if you can comment a bit of how security or crime fighting, for example, is framed in Serbian media, and how do you think that influences what's possible, imaginable, desired as a priority? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aisha.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your question. I see that we don't have a lot of time, so I'll quickly answer that. The Agnipath scheme, how it is implemented is that the military is not taking over the job of providing, say, employment or anything else. They are two very separate things. So this is initially a scheme that has been brought out by the government with due process, and while a part of it focuses the 25% of the people who will be inducted, that is primarily aimed at increasing the security architecture, strengthening the security architecture of the country. We are also focusing on the 75% of the people who won't be there. They're giving 4 years of their life to this training. So, the government, the onus is on the government to provide them and provide them with an opportunity to go to transition into a second career. So this is precisely something that the government is doing, not the military. The military is nowhere in the picture in terms of the development side of the scheme.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I think we can continue the conversations afterwards as well. Alexandra.
Thank you, Sonia, for great questions. So, for example, in 2015, when the migrant crisis started, the political agenda and the main political narrative was more positive for welcoming people, for thinking about how to maybe integrate them, and it continued until 2017, when stories of integration in the media were more frequent than in the later years. So the public opinion followed it, and the media representation and the media narrative always in Serbia follows political agenda, because we all know that the media freedom is decreasing. It's been decreasing for the past 10 years, and all indexes of democracy, of Reporters Without Borders, or freedom of the world shows that the media are instrumentalized and very often follow the political agenda. So as soon as the political narrative changes, the media follow that, or they are working together to foster this kind of narrative. So regarding the and it got worse in the past couple of years, especially with the COVID in 2020, when you had the borders closed for so many reasons. And the migrants and refugees were usually represented as those who are bringing the disease into the country and spreading the disease, etc. It's not only with COVID. We had in newspaper coverage the misrepresentation of them spreading HIV, AIDS, etc., etc. So it's kind of a worsening narrative over years. And in 2015, there were more images that I've identified of politicians, ministers going on borders, meeting with people, more images of women and children, which are in other cultures, for example, in Australia, represented as a culture of hospitality. If you want to show a welcoming nation, you are putting more photographs of women and children in there. In the 469 images I analyzed, there are only 50 images of women and children. So it says something about our coverage. And regarding your other question, how security is often represented in the media, my colleague, Professor Filipaides, and I, we have done together research with our colleague from the faculty, Nebojša Vladisavljević, about how the LGBT minority has been represented. It's the same thing. You've been putting vulnerable groups in the ghetto and not giving them access to the media. And it's always represented from the side of the security providers, from the view of the police and the view of the military. And it's the pretty same thing. Rarely our media get into the group and take photographs and actually cover the news from inside the group. You are standing outside that circle. So it's a very, very big thing to think about. I hope I answered the question.
Thanks so much. I know we're running over time, so I guess I just want to make a few concluding remarks. For me, I think one of the major takeaways from working with you from reading your abstracts, your draft papers, has been that the post-2030 agenda needs to be informed by what's happening on the ground. You know, when I often research the security development nexus, it's an abstract concept, conceptually muddled, etc. And often there is a lack of empirical analysis about how it works in practice. So I think if there's one takeaway from today, it can be that that's what needs to inform the next steps after 2030. I also just want to end again on a positive note. You know, the SDGs, and I have to say this from behalf of my organization as well, do provide a scope, an entry point to have these discussions. And I think we mustn't forget where we've come in the last 20 years. Things are gloomy, there are many challenges, but I really hope together we can confront them. So with that, I want to thank you for all your work and everything. Also, of course, our host, BCSP, and everyone else that's been involved in the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello. So there's going to be another coffee break. If you would like to listen to the next panel, panel 8, the human dimension of security, that's going to start in 15 minutes. And if you are more interested, although it is difficult to make a decision, in the panel 9, how to counter disinformation in the Western Balkans, that's going to start in 30 minutes next door in Crystal Hall 1. That's a parallel panel, okay? Thanks, everyone.